He simply decided to tear down an old shed in his backyard and expected nothing unusual. But one strike of the excavator uncovered something that had been hidden underground for decades. What the workers found shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Ethan Walker had built his life around endurance long before he ever thought of it as a skill. It was not something he wore with pride or spoke about when people asked who he was. It was simply the quiet condition of his existence, the way his days unfolded one after another with measured steps, careful choices, and a constant awareness of limits. He woke each morning before the alarm, not because he was restless or ambitious, but because his body had learned that preparedness reduced risk. The earlier he rose, the more control he had over the day ahead, and control was the closest thing to safety he knew. He moved through his small kitchen with the efficiency of habit, preparing coffee, checking the weather, glancing at the calendar pinned to the refrigerator door. The calendar was less a reminder of events and more a ledger of obligations. Utility bills, mortgage payments, insurance dates, maintenance schedules. Each square represented something that had to be met, managed, or survived. There was little room for spontaneity in his life, and he had made peace with that long ago. At 42, Ethan carried himself with a stillness that often made people underestimate him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate rather than relaxed. Years of physical work had shaped his body into something solid and reliable, even as the strain showed in small ways. The stiffness in his back in the mornings, the faint lines around his eyes that came not from laughter, but from long nights spent calculating what could and could not be afforded. His skin bore the deep tone of his heritage, a visible reminder that the world had not always offered him the benefit of doubt, and his expression had settled into one of calm neutrality, a shield he had learned to maintain. He had grown up learning that stability was never guaranteed. His childhood had been shaped by adults who worked hard but never seemed to get ahead, by moments when things fell apart without warning and had to be pieced back together with whatever was available. There were no safety nets waiting beneath him, no relatives ready to step in and absorb the shock of a bad month or a sudden expense. Responsibility had arrived early in his life, and once it did, it never truly left. As a young man, Ethan had learned to value predictability above all else. He did not chase opportunities that promised fast rewards, but came with uncertainty. He chose paths that were slower, quieter, and more reliable. That philosophy led him to his job with the municipal maintenance department, a role that suited him in ways few others could. He was a technical specialist, responsible for maintaining systems most people never thought about until they failed. Electrical panels in public buildings, emergency generators, ventilation systems, security access controls. His work existed in the background of daily life, unnoticed when done well, immediately blamed when something went wrong. His days followed a steady rhythm. Requests came in, problems were assessed, solutions implemented. Teachers, administrators, city employees, and contractors interacted with him briefly, often impatiently, eager for their issue to be resolved so they could move on. Rarely did anyone ask his name. Rarely did anyone thank him. And yet, Ethan took a quiet pride in his work. He knew that his diligence kept buildings functional and people safe, even if they never realized it. He did things properly because cutting corners had consequences, and consequences were things he could not afford. Financially, his life was a constant exercise in balance. His income was enough to live on, but not enough to absorb mistakes. He tracked every expense with careful attention, not out of obsession, but necessity. He knew how much he could spend on groceries without affecting the mortgage. He knew how much fuel his car consumed and planned his routes accordingly. He delayed purchases, repaired things himself when possible, and accepted inconvenience as a reasonable trade for security. His fear was not poverty itself, but instability, the kind that crept in through one broken appliance or one unexpected repair and spiraled into something unmanageable. The house he lived in was the result of years of restraint and patience. When he finally signed the papers, it was not a celebration but a calculated relief. The structure sat on the edge of an aging neighborhood, its design unmistakably rooted in the early 1960s. Thick concrete foundations, low ceilings, narrow hallways, and rooms arranged in ways that reflected an era shaped by both optimism and paranoia. The house had been built when people believed the future could be bright, but only if they prepared for its worst possibilities. Ethan had noticed those details immediately. The reinforced walls, the odd storage spaces, the sense that the house had been designed to endure more than ordinary weather. It was not beautiful in a modern sense, but it felt solid, and solidity mattered to him more than aesthetics. The first weeks living there had been marked by a quiet unease, a sense that the house carried memories that did not belong to him. At night, the silence felt heavier than it had in his previous apartment, pressing in around him as though the walls themselves were listening. But over time, that unease softened into familiarity. The house did not fight him. It accepted him, just as he accepted its flaws. There were quirks he could not ignore. The wiring was outdated and needed careful management. The windows leaked cold air in winter and heat in summer. The floors creaked, not dramatically, but persistently, as if the house was constantly reminding him of its age. Ethan addressed these issues slowly, methodically, repairing what he could afford to repair, postponing what he could not. Each improvement felt like an investment not just in the structure, but in his own sense of permanence. And then there was the backyard. From the day he moved in, it had been the one part of the property he avoided confronting. At first glance, it seemed merely neglected, but the longer he lived there, the more it unsettled him. A massive, dead tree dominated the space, its branches clawing upward like skeletal fingers. Its roots had long since broken through the concrete walkway, warping it into uneven slabs and threatening the drainage beneath. Nearby, the remains of an old wooden shed leaned at an unnatural angle, and its roof partially collapsed, its boards softened by decades of moisture and decay. The ground itself felt wrong. In certain places, it dipped unexpectedly, as though something beneath the surface had shifted or given way. After heavy rain, water pooled where it should not have, draining slowly and unevenly. Ethan noticed these things not as a homeowner obsessed with perfection, but as a man trained to recognize structural problems before they escalated. Each time he looked out the kitchen window, he felt a tightening in his chest, a quiet warning that the yard was not just unsightly, but potentially dangerous. For years, he told himself it could wait. There were always more pressing concerns. A leaky pipe inside the house, a rise in utility costs, a car repair that could not be postponed. The backyard became a problem he managed by not thinking about it, a corner of his life pushed aside in favor of immediate survival. But avoidance did not erase the risk. It only delayed it. The turning point came gradually, not through a single dramatic event, but through accumulation. A storm that sent branches crashing down closer to the house than before. A new crack in the concrete path that widened after each rainfall. a subtle shift in the soil near the foundation that made him uneasy. Ethan understood the implications well enough. If the roots continued to spread, they could compromise the structure of the house itself. If the ground continued to erode, repairs would become exponentially more expensive. He began to save. The process was slow and deliberate. He set aside small amounts whenever he could, resisting the temptation to touch that money even when other things demanded attention. There were months when the savings barely grew, months when unexpected expenses forced him to dip into what he had set aside. But he persisted, driven by the knowledge that inaction carried its own cost. During this time, his relationship with the house deepened in ways he had not anticipated. It was no longer just a shelter or an investment. It was an extension of his own endurance, a place he had claimed through patience rather than luck. He found himself imagining what the backyard could become, not something extravagant, but safe. A level patch of ground, clear space, no hidden threats. When the savings finally reached an amount that made action possible, Ethan felt a cautious resolve settle over him. He knew exactly what he wanted and what he did not. No landscaping projects, no cosmetic improvements, just removal of the hazards and stabilization of the ground. He approached the task with the same mindset he brought to his work, defining boundaries, setting limits, and preparing for contingencies. As he began researching contractors, comparing prices, and reading reviews, he felt the familiar tension of stepping into uncertainty. This was not just another repair. It was a confrontation with the one part of his home that had resisted his control. Still, he reminded himself that avoiding the problem would only make it worse. Endurance did not mean standing still. It meant choosing the right moment to act. By the time he scheduled the work, Ethan had convinced himself that he was prepared. He believed he had accounted for the risks, the costs, and the potential complications. He had no idea that the ground beneath his backyard was holding something far beyond what his careful planning could anticipate. The house, which had seemed merely old and stubborn, was quietly waiting to reveal a history deeper than he had ever imagined. And Ethan, a man who had built his life on caution, was standing at the edge of a discovery that would test every assumption he had ever made about control, stability, and survival. The decision to finally confront the backyard did not arrive with relief. It came with a slow, tightening sense of inevitability, as though Ethan Walker had reached a point where standing still was no longer neutral, but actively dangerous. From the kitchen window, the yard looked unchanged, just as it had every other morning. But now that he had committed to acting, every detail seemed sharper, more insistent, impossible to ignore. The dead tree dominated the space like a silent accusation. Its trunk was thick and darkened with age, the bark split and peeling in places where time and weather had taken their toll. No leaves had appeared on its branches for years, yet it continued to stand, stubborn and hollow, as if it refused to acknowledge its own lifelessness. The branches reached upward and outward in irregular patterns, casting jagged shadows across the yard whenever the sun was low. In strong winds, they groaned and creaked, producing sounds that unsettled Ethan in a way he could never quite explain. It was not fear, exactly, but the persistent awareness that something large and unstable was looming too close to his home. The roots were the real problem. Thick, gnarled limbs of wood pushed visibly through the soil, cracking the concrete walkway that once led cleanly from the back door to the far end of the yard. The path was no longer a path at all, but a series of uneven slabs tilted at awkward angles. Water collected between them after rain, seeping downward into places Ethan could not see. He knew enough about foundations and drainage to understand what that meant. The roots did not stop at the surface. They traveled outward and downward, exerting pressure on everything in their way. Near the fence line stood the remnants of a wooden shed, though calling it a structure felt generous. It leaned heavily to one side, supported more by habit than integrity. The boards were swollen and soft, streaked with moss and discoloration. The roof sagged inward, its shingles curled and broken, leaving gaps through which rain and debris freely entered. Whatever purpose the shed had once served had been forgotten long before Ethan moved in. Now it was little more than a collapsing shell, a hazard waiting for the right moment to fail completely. The ground beneath all of it was uneven in subtle but troubling ways. Some areas felt firm, while others shifted slightly underfoot, as though the soil had lost its cohesion. After storms, Ethan noticed that water did not drain evenly. It lingered in shallow pools that took days to disappear. In dry weather, faint depressions became visible where the earth seemed to have settled. These were not dramatic sinkholes or obvious collapses, but small irregularities that suggested something beneath the surface was no longer stable. For a long time, Ethan had tried to convince himself that these were normal signs of an aging property. Houses from that era often came with quirks, and many homeowners lived with far worse conditions without consequence. But he also knew that ignoring early warning signs was how small issues became catastrophic failures. His professional instincts, sharpened by years of maintaining systems that were only noticed when they broke, kept circling back to the same conclusion. The yard was not just neglected, it was compromised. Still, knowing that and acting on it were two very different things. For years, Ethan had postponed the work not because he lacked awareness, but because he lacked margin. Every dollar he earned already had a purpose. The mortgage payment came first, always. Utilities followed, then insurance, fuel, groceries, and the slow, steady costs of keeping the house functional. Whenever something unexpected arose, a worn appliance, a car repair, a rise in heating costs during winter, it was the savings that absorbed the impact. There was never enough left over to justify taking on a major outdoor project, especially one with so many unknown, and there was also a quieter, more personal hesitation. The backyard represented a kind of unresolved tension in Ethan's life. Inside the house, he had made progress. He had fixed wiring issues, patched walls, replaced fixtures, and gradually imposed order on a space that had initially felt foreign. The yard, by contrast, remained wild and unyielding. It resisted his efforts, his budget, and his sense of control. Confronting it meant acknowledging that some problems could not be managed incrementally. Some demanded decisive, costly action. So he waited. He told himself that as long as the tree stayed upright and the shed remained standing, the danger was manageable. He avoided walking across certain sections of the yard. He kept the back door closed during storms, preferring not to watch the branches sway too close to the house. He directed his attention elsewhere, focusing on work, routine, and the interior improvements that felt safer and more predictable. But time has a way of pressing its case. One autumn night, a storm passed through the neighborhood with more force than usual. Wind battered the house, rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rolled overhead in long, heavy waves. Ethan lay awake, listening. When a loud crack echoed from the backyard, sharp enough to cut through the storm's roar, he felt a jolt of adrenaline surge through him. The sound was followed by a heavy thud, then silence. At first light, he went outside to assess the damage. A large branch from the dead tree had snapped and fallen, landing only a few feet from the foundation. The ground around it was torn and churned, exposing more of the root system beneath. The sight left him unsettled. This time, the warning had been clear. Over the following weeks, Ethan noticed other changes. The crack in the concrete walkway widened noticeably. One corner of the yard seemed to sink slightly after each rainfall. These were not dramatic shifts, but they were cumulative, and they reinforced what he had been trying to avoid. The situation was deteriorating, and waiting longer would only increase the risk and the eventual cost. That was when he committed fully to saving for the work. He approached the task the same way he approached everything else, methodically and without illusions. He calculated a rough estimate of what the work might cost based on local averages, and then added a buffer, knowing that outdoor projects rarely stayed within initial projections. He set a target and began setting aside small amounts whenever possible. Some weeks it was barely noticeable. Other weeks he managed to add a bit more. The progress was slow, sometimes frustratingly so, but it was progress nonetheless. There were setbacks. A sudden increase in utility rates forced him to pause contributions for a month. A minor car repair drained part of what he had saved. Each time, he felt the familiar frustration of being pulled backward just as he was gaining momentum. But he refused to abandon the goal. The yard had become a symbol of something larger, a test of whether he could address a problem that demanded more than patchwork solutions. As the savings grew, so did his awareness of the yard's presence. He found himself studying it more closely, noting patterns he had previously ignored. The way the ground sloped slightly toward the house in certain areas. The way the tree's shadow fell across the foundation at different times of day. The way the shed seemed to lean further with each passing season. These observations did not bring him comfort, but they reinforced his resolve. When he finally reached an amount that felt sufficient to begin, Ethan did not celebrate. Instead, he felt a cautious tension settle over him, the same feeling he experienced before undertaking any major task with long-term consequences. He knew that this was not just about removing a tree or clearing debris. It was about reclaiming control over a part of his home that had remained stubbornly outside his influence. He began researching contractors during his lunch breaks and evenings. He avoided large companies with glossy websites and inflated promises. He looked instead for small, independent crews with solid reputations and straightforward pricing. He read reviews carefully, paying attention to patterns rather than isolated complaints. He asked detailed questions when he called, listening not just to the answers but to how they were given. Experience had taught him that transparency mattered more than enthusiasm. Eventually, he found a crew that seemed to fit his needs. They were local, practical, and willing to take on a limited scope of work. When the owner came by to assess the yard, Ethan walked him through the property, pointing out exactly what needed to be done and what did not. He made it clear that his budget was fixed and that he was not interested in expanding the project beyond, removing the dead tree, dismantling the shed remains, and leveling the ground enough to eliminate immediate hazards. The assessment was brief but thorough. The owner took measurements, examined the tree and its roots, and noted the condition of the soil. He did not promise miracles or make light of the challenges. When he quoted a price, it was high enough to make Ethan pause, but not so high that it shattered his plans. After a night of careful consideration, Ethan agreed. The contract was simple and specific. 1 day of work, tree removal, Shed demolition, basic ground clearing, no landscaping, no cosmetic improvements, no extras. Ethan read it twice before signing, making sure there were no vague clauses or open-ended commitments. He needed this to be contained, predictable, and manageable. As the scheduled day approached, Ethan felt a mixture of anticipation and unease. He reminded himself that this was a necessary step, that addressing the problem now would prevent far greater trouble later. Still, a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered that the yard had resisted him for years for a reason. He dismissed the thought as superstition, a byproduct of stress and fatigue. On the eve of the work, he stood at the kitchen window once more, looking out at the shadowed shapes of the tree and shed under the dim glow of the streetlight. The yard was silent, unmoving, giving no hint of what lay beneath its surface. Ethan felt the weight of the decision settle fully into his chest. Tomorrow, the ground would be broken. Whatever had been hidden, intentionally or by chance, would be disturbed. He turned away from the window, unaware that the act of finally confronting the yard would not only change the landscape behind his house, but would also open a path into a history far deeper and more consequential than he had ever imagined. The morning the work was scheduled to begin arrived without ceremony, yet it carried a weight Ethan Walker could not shake. He woke earlier than usual, long before the light crept over the rooftops, and lay still for several minutes, listening to the quiet of the house. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, not excitement, but the steady tension that accompanied moments when routine was about to be disrupted. This was not a day that would pass unnoticed. The backyard, long ignored and carefully avoided, was finally about to be opened up. By the time he brewed his coffee, the sky had begun to pale, the darkness thinning into a muted gray. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter and drank slowly, his gaze drifting again and again toward the back window. Outside, the yard looked unchanged, the dead tree standing as it always had, the broken shed leaning in silent defiance. It was hard to imagine that within a few hours the space would be transformed by noise, movement, and intrusion. Harder still to imagine that anything unexpected might be waiting beneath the surface. The sound of a truck pulling up broke the stillness. Then another. Ethan set his cup down and stepped outside just as the small excavation crew began unloading equipment at the edge of his driveway. The men moved with practiced efficiency, exchanging brief nods and gestures as they prepared for the day. An excavator was eased down from a trailer, and its metal treads pressing into the asphalt before rolling slowly toward the backyard. Chainsaws, shovels, pry bars, and assorted tools were laid out with care. The scene felt strangely intrusive, as though his private space had been temporarily transformed into a work site that no longer belonged solely to him. Ethan greeted the crew, reiterating the boundaries of the job with the same careful clarity he had used during the planning stage. He explained again what he needed done and what he did not. There were no questions from the workers that suggested misunderstanding. They listened, nodded, and assured him that the scope was clear. It was a conversation he had rehearsed mentally many times, driven by the fear that a single miscommunication could lead to unexpected costs or complications. When the excavator finally moved into position near the dead tree, Ethan stepped back toward the house, giving the crew room to work. The first bite of the machine into the earth was jarring. The sound was louder than he had anticipated, a grinding mechanical roar that vibrated through the ground and into the walls of the house. The bucket tore into the soil around the tree's base, dislodging clumps of earth and exposing thick roots that twisted downward like buried limbs. Nearby, another worker began cutting away fallen branches, the chainsaw's sharp whine slicing through the morning air. Despite the noise, Ethan felt a cautious sense of satisfaction as the work progressed. The tree that had loomed over his home for years was finally being dismantled piece by piece. Each root pulled free, each branch hauled away, felt like the removal of a long-standing threat. The shed followed soon after. Its weakened structure offered little resistance as the crew pried it apart, loading the warped boards and rotted beams into a truck bed in rough, uneven piles. With each passing hour, the yard began to look less chaotic, more open, as though it were shedding layers of neglect. Ethan watched from the back door for a while, then retreated inside to focus on his own tasks, checking on the work periodically. The constant noise became a backdrop rather than a disturbance, a reminder that something tangible was finally being accomplished. He allowed himself, briefly, to imagine what the space might look like by evening. Clear ground. No looming tree. No collapsing structure. Just a safer, more manageable extension of his home. It was near midday when the sound changed. At first, Ethan barely noticed it. The excavator had been digging steadily around the massive root system, and the noises blended together in a rough, mechanical rhythm. But then the engine pitch shifted abruptly, and the familiar grind of tearing roots was replaced by a sharper, hollow tone. It was a sound that did not belong to soil or wood. It echoed in a way that made Ethan's attention snap instantly back to the yard. The excavator stopped. Silence followed, broken only by the idle hum of the machine and the distant sounds of the neighborhood. Ethan stepped outside, drawn by a sudden sense of unease. The operator had climbed out of the cab and was standing at the edge of the excavation, staring downward. Two other workers hovered nearby, exchanging puzzled looks. For a moment, Ethan could not see what had caused the interruption. The pit, where the tree once stood, had grown deeper and wider, the soil around it uneven and freshly disturbed. Then he noticed it. Beneath the loose dirt and tangled roots, something flat and gray had been revealed. One of the workers climbed carefully into the pit and knelt, brushing away soil with a hand shovel. The more he cleared, the more defined the surface became. It was concrete. Not the fractured, uneven remnants of an old foundation or discarded slab, but a smooth, uniform surface with clean edges. When the worker tapped it lightly with his shovel, the sound that came back was unmistakable. Hollow, resonant, as though there was empty space beneath. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He moved closer, crouching at the edge of the pit to get a better look. As more dirt was scraped away, a faint metallic seam became visible along one edge of the concrete. It framed part of the slab with deliberate precision. This was not something poured casually or left unfinished. It was part of a structure. The operator muttered something under his breath and motioned for the worker to continue clearing around the edges. Another man joined him, carefully widening the exposed area. Each strike of the shovel produced the same unsettling echo. The sound seemed to travel through the ground, vibrating faintly under Ethan's feet. Confusion gave way to apprehension. Ethan's mind raced through possibilities, none of them reassuring. Old septic tanks, buried utilities, unpermitted structures, forgotten hazards. Each scenario carried implications of cost, liability, and delay. This was exactly the kind of unexpected complication he had feared, the kind that could unravel years of careful planning in an instant. Yet, alongside the fear, something else stirred. Curiosity. The slab extended farther than Ethan had initially realized. As the workers cleared more soil, its scale became apparent. This was not a small feature or isolated obstruction. It spanned a significant portion of the yard, disappearing beneath untouched earth on all sides. One worker moved several feet away and struck the ground again. The same hollow response came back. Step by step, they tested the area, mapping the unseen boundaries through sound. Ethan watched, his unease deepening into a quiet dread. He knew enough about construction to understand that large, concealed structures beneath residential properties were rarely benign. They meant complexity. They meant expense. They meant decisions he had not prepared to make. Still, the work continued. As the excavation widened, something metallic caught the light near one corner of the slab. It was partially obscured by packed soil and roots, but its shape was unmistakable. A hinge. The workers slowed, switching to brushes and smaller tools, their professional instincts fully engaged. They worked methodically, uncovering the object bit by bit until the outline of a heavy, rusted metal hatch emerged. The hatch was set into the concrete with care. Its surface bore the scars of age, rust flaking away in patches to reveal dull metal beneath. Faded traces of paint clung stubbornly to the edges, suggesting it had once been coated, perhaps to protect it or disguise it. Thick hinges connected it to the slab, and hardened sealant lined the seams, cracked but still clinging as if reluctant to let go. Ethan felt a strange pressure build behind his eyes. The side of the hatch stirred something deeper than fear, an instinctive awareness that this discovery marked a turning point. Whatever lay beneath that metal door had been placed there deliberately, hidden with intention. It was not debris or accident. It was a threshold. The crew gathered around the pit, speaking in low voices. Their excitement was tempered by caution, but it was evident in their movements and expressions. They had uncovered something unusual, something that went beyond the scope of their routine work. The operator glanced at Ethan, his face serious, and gestured toward the hatch. Ethan nodded slowly, though his thoughts were racing. He did not yet understand what they were about to find, or how deeply it would alter the quiet, controlled life he had built. He only knew that the ground beneath his backyard had spoken at last, and it had revealed a secret that could no longer remain buried. As the workers began preparing tools to pry the hatch open, Ethan stood at the edge of the excavation, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The noise of the neighborhood seemed distant now, muffled by the gravity of what lay before them. The yard was no longer just a problem to be solved. It had become a doorway into something vast, unsettling, and irrevocably real. Whatever had been hidden beneath his home for decades was about to be exposed, and Ethan, a man who had spent his life minimizing risk, found himself standing at the edge of the unknown, unable to turn away. The air around the excavation felt heavier the longer Ethan stood there, as if the ground itself resisted what was about to happen. The workers moved with a deliberate slowness now, their earlier rhythm replaced by a cautious attentiveness. This was no longer routine labor. The hatch had changed the nature of the work, transforming a simple backyard project into something undefined and potentially serious. Before anyone touched the metal door again, the crew focused on stabilizing the area. Loose soil was reinforced along the edges of the pit. Boards were placed to prevent collapse, and tools were repositioned so nothing would slip or fall inward. The operator insisted on caution, not out of fear, but experience. He had seen enough unexpected discoveries over the years to know that haste was how people got hurt. Ethan appreciated this restraint. It mirrored his own instincts, the impulse to pause and assess before committing to irreversible action. When the workers finally returned their attention to the hatch, Ethan was struck by how deliberate its construction appeared. The concrete surrounding it was not cracked or crumbling, but smooth and intact, as though it had been poured with precision and allowed to cure undisturbed. The metal door itself was thick, far heavier than anything one would expect to find in a residential yard. Rust coated much of its surface, but it was the slow, even corrosion of age, not the jagged decay of neglect. This was metal that had been protected once, sealed away from the elements until time alone wore it down. One of the workers scraped away the remaining soil along the edges, revealing the full outline of the hatch. It was rectangular, its proportions measured and intentional. A faint seam ran around its perimeter, filled with hardened sealant that had cracked but not fully separated. Whatever lay beneath had been meant to remain closed, perhaps permanently. Ethan crouched near the pit, his gaze fixed on the door. His thoughts raced, but none of them formed into clear conclusions. He felt the familiar pull of responsibility tighten in his chest. This was his property. Whatever this was, it belonged to him now, along with all the consequences. He wondered briefly whether the previous owner had known what he was leaving behind, whether this was an oversight or a deliberate silence. The workers prepared to open the hatch with care. A pry bar was slid cautiously beneath the rusted lip, its metal scraping softly against metal. The sound made Ethan tense, a thin, grating noise that seemed far too loud in the quiet afternoon. As pressure was applied, the hatch resisted, unmoving at first, as though it were testing their resolve. Then it shifted. The sound that followed was not sharp, but deep and strained, a long groan that echoed up from beneath the earth. Rust flakes broke free and drifted into the air, catching the light briefly before settling back into the pit. The hatch lifted slowly, inch by reluctant inch, its hinges protesting every movement. The smell reached Ethan before he could see anything clearly. It was dry and stale, a blend of dust, old concrete, and cold metal, the scent of a space that had been sealed away from the world for decades. As the opening widened, darkness revealed itself beneath the door. It was not the shallow darkness of a hole in the ground, but something deeper, more absolute. One of the workers shone a flashlight downward, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a vertical shaft lined with smooth concrete walls. A metal ladder was bolted securely to one side, and its rungs coated in a thin layer of corrosion, but still solid in appearance. The shaft descended farther than Ethan expected. 8, perhaps 9 feet down, the ladder ended at a small landing. Beyond that, the light revealed the edge of a corridor stretching away into darkness. The walls were straight, the corners sharp. This was not a pit or a tank. It was a passage. For a moment, no one spoke. The open hatch seemed to hold the yard in suspension, as though the world above was waiting for the space below to acknowledge it. Ethan felt a subtle shift inside himself, a recognition that this discovery had crossed a boundary. What lay beneath was not an accident or an afterthought. It was a constructed world, deliberately hidden and carefully preserved. The operator broke the silence, explaining calmly that before anything else could be done, someone would need to assess the stability and safety of the structure below. The air quality, the integrity of the ladder, the condition of the walls. These were not concerns to be dismissed. Ethan listened, nodding, his attention fixed on the dark opening. He understood the logic, but he also felt something more personal stirring beneath it. He did not want someone else to be the first to step into that space. The realization surprised him. He was not an adventurous man, nor did he seek out danger. But this was his home, his land, his responsibility. Allowing someone else to enter first felt like surrendering something he could not articulate. He wanted to see it for himself, to understand what had been hidden beneath his life without intermediaries. The crew prepared a rope harness as a precaution. A gas detector was lowered briefly to test the air. The readings came back normal, the oxygen levels safe, the absence of toxic gases reassuring. One of the younger workers volunteered to go down first, eager and curious, but Ethan shook his head slowly. He would go. The operator hesitated, then accepted the decision with a measured nod. He helped Ethan into the harness, explaining each strap and connection carefully. A flashlight was handed down, its weight solid in Ethan's grip. The ladder was tested again, each rung pressed firmly to ensure it could bear weight. Standing at the edge of the pit, Ethan took a moment to steady himself. He was acutely aware of his heartbeat, of the quiet murmur of the workers behind him, of the open sky above. Then he turned and placed his foot on the first rung of the ladder. The descent was slower than he expected. Each step echoed softly within the shaft. The sound carried upward and returned to him in faint reverberations. As he moved down, the daylight receded, replaced by the focused circle of his flashlight beam. The temperature shifted subtly, the air cooler, more still. It felt like leaving one world and entering another, guided by nothing but his own resolve and the thin line of metal beneath his hands. When his boots reached the landing, Ethan paused. The concrete beneath his feet was smooth and level, free of debris or moisture. The ladder was anchored firmly, its bolts embedded deeply into the wall. Everything about the construction spoke of intention and competence. He turned his attention to the corridor ahead. The passage stretched away from the landing, its length obscured by darkness. The walls were unbroken concrete, their surfaces finished carefully rather than roughly poured. Along one side, a series of metal conduits ran parallel to the floor, disappearing into the shadows. Ventilation grills were set at intervals near the ceiling, their openings clean and unobstructed. This was not a crude shelter dug in haste. It was engineered. Ethan felt a chill pass through him, not from the cold, but from the implications. Someone had built this place with knowledge, resources, and a clear purpose. They had chosen this spot beneath an ordinary house, and they had gone to great lengths to conceal it. Behind him, the sounds of the surface world were muted but present. He could hear faint movements above, the murmur of voices distorted by distance and concrete. But those sounds felt remote, as though they belonged to another life. He took a step forward into the corridor. The light from his flashlight revealed more details as he advanced slowly. The floor was clean, coated with a thin layer of dust that had settled undisturbed for years. There were no signs of water intrusion, no stains or mold. The air was dry, preserved. The space felt dormant rather than abandoned, as though it had simply been waiting. Ethan's mind struggled to reconcile what he was seeing with the modest house above. This place did not belong to a forgotten shed or a neglected yard. It belonged to a different scale of thinking, one that anticipated prolonged isolation and survival. After several careful steps, he stopped and looked back toward the ladder. The opening above seemed smaller now, a rectangle of pale light framed by concrete and shadow. He understood, with a clarity that startled him, that he had crossed a point of no return. Even if he climbed back up and sealed the hatch, this knowledge would remain. The house he thought he understood had revealed a hidden dimension, one that would not simply disappear. Ethan stood in the corridor, his breath slow and controlled, the beam of his flashlight steady in his hand. Above him was the life he had built through patience and restraint. Around him was a world shaped by fear, preparation, and secrecy. He did not yet know where the passage led or what it contained, but he knew with certainty that the ground beneath his home was no longer silent. It had opened, and it was inviting him deeper. Ethan took another step forward, then another, allowing his eyes to adjust to the muted light of the flashlight and the unfamiliar geometry of the corridor. The concrete walls absorbed sound in a way that made every movement feel deliberate, amplified by the quiet. Each footfall seemed to echo not loudly, but persistently, as if the space itself were acknowledging his presence after a long period of abandonment. The air was cool and dry, holding no trace of dampness or decay. That fact alone unsettled him. Anything buried underground for decades should have shown signs of surrender to time. Yet this place felt intact, preserved, waiting. The corridor was wider than he had initially realized. Tall enough that he did not need to duck, broad enough to allow equipment or supplies to be moved through with ease. The walls bore faint marks where conduits had been installed with precision, running straight and level along one side before disappearing into the ceiling at regular intervals. Ventilation grills were set flush into the concrete, their metal edges dulled but undamaged. Whoever had designed this space had not merely carved out a shelter. They had planned a system. As Ethan advanced, the beam of his flashlight revealed the first doorway on the right. It was not a simple wooden door or a flimsy partition, but a reinforced slab of metal set into a concrete frame. The latch was thick, industrial, its mechanism stiff with age, but still recognizably functional. He hesitated for a moment, listening to the faint sounds from above that filtered down the shaft, grounding himself in the knowledge that he was not entirely alone. Then he reached out and pulled the latch free. The door opened with a low, resistant sound, metal protesting as it moved after years of stillness. The room beyond was small, but unmistakably human. A metal-framed cot rested against one wall, its thin mattress collapsed inward, the fabric brittle and discolored with age. A small table stood nearby, its surface coated in a fine layer of dust that bore the faint outlines of objects long removed. The shapes were subtle, but unmistakable. The circular impression of a cup, the rectangular shadow of a book or tool. The walls were bare now, but Ethan could see lighter patches where something had once been affixed. Posters, perhaps, or notes. The idea that someone had spent time here, had lived within these walls, pressed against him with quiet intensity. This was not a place built solely to hide. It was a place meant to be inhabited. In one corner, a narrow cabinet stood half open. Ethan approached cautiously and pulled the door wider. Inside were remnants of ordinary life, stripped of their context by time. A dented metal cup, a few empty glass jars with cracked lids, a small folding knife, its handle worn smooth from use. These were not artifacts of wealth or power. They were tools of survival, chosen for function rather than sentiment. He stepped back, letting the room settle into his awareness. There was an intimacy here that made him uncomfortable, as though he were trespassing into the private endurance of another person. He closed the door gently and continued down the corridor. The next room was larger and immediately different in purpose. Shelving units lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each shelf stacked with items arranged in careful order. Cans of preserved food filled several rows, their labels faded but still legible in places. Some bore dates from decades past, written by hand in dark ink. Others were sealed in plain packaging, utilitarian and anonymous. The sight stirred something in Ethan that bordered on awe. This was not hoarding. This was preparation. Along one wall, crates held tools wrapped in cloth, preserved against rust and wear. Wrenches, hammers, screwdrivers, handsaws, and coils of rope were secured with a meticulousness that suggested regular inspection, even if that inspection had long since ceased. Nearby, metal canisters once used for fuel sat empty but clean, their presence hinting at systems that had once functioned here, lights that had once burned, machines that had once hummed softly in the background. On an upper shelf, Ethan spotted objects that carried a different weight. Folded maps, sealed inside thick plastic sleeves, lay stacked beside survival manuals and field guides. A radiation detection device rested nearby, its casing cracked but intact, the needle frozen at rest. The presence of such equipment anchored the bunker firmly in a particular era of fear and anticipation. This was a place built in response to a world that had felt fragile and unpredictable. Ethan moved slowly through the room, absorbing the scale of the effort it represented. The amount of time, resources, and intention required to assemble and maintain such a stockpile was staggering. This was not the work of a casual homeowner or a passing obsession. It was the result of years of focused commitment, driven by a belief that retreat and preparation were the only viable responses to what lay ahead. Beyond the storage area, the corridor continued, bending slightly before revealing another reinforced door. This one opened into a workspace. A heavy table occupied the center of the room, its surface covered with papers that had yellowed but remained surprisingly intact. The dryness of the bunker had preserved them, protecting ink and pencil marks from the erosion of moisture. Shelves lined the walls, filled with binders, notebooks, and rolled diagrams. Ethan approached the table, his flashlight beam sweeping across the scattered pages. They were covered in handwritten notes, calculations, and sketches. Some detailed ventilation systems, airflow patterns, and structural reinforcements. Others mapped out the bunker itself, room by room, with annotations noting capacities, usage, and contingency plans. The handwriting was steady and precise, the work of someone methodical and disciplined. It was here that Ethan found the journals. They were stacked neatly, bound in plain covers, each labeled with a year. He picked one up carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The pages crackled softly as he opened it, revealing dense lines of writing. The entries were dated and orderly, chronicling not just the construction of the bunker, but the thoughts and fears that had driven it. He did not read deeply yet. The mere presence of the journals was enough to send a ripple of unease through him. This was no longer just a physical structure. It was a record of a mind shaped by anxiety, foresight, and isolation. As Ethan stood there, the beam of his flashlight caught something odd along the far wall. A section of concrete appeared subtly different, its surface texture slightly smoother, its edges too straight to be incidental. He stepped closer, his professional instincts sharpening. He tapped the wall lightly with the handle of the flashlight. The sound that came back was wrong, hollow, muted in a way that suggested space beyond. A quiet tension settled over him. He did not investigate further yet, but the implication lingered. This bunker had layers, both literal and figurative. What he had seen so far felt like only the outer shell. When he finally turned back toward the ladder, Ethan felt the weight of what he had discovered pressing in from all sides. The space beneath his home was not a forgotten cellar or a crude shelter. It was a carefully designed world, sealed away with purpose. Someone had built this place not just to survive a catastrophe, but to endure it alone, cut off from the surface for as long as necessary. As he climbed back up the ladder, the light from above growing brighter with each step, Ethan knew that nothing about his house would ever feel simple again. The quiet stability he had worked so hard to maintain had been pierced by the revelation of a hidden past, one that demanded understanding. The corridor, the rooms, the journals, all of it pointed toward a story that had been waiting decades to be uncovered. And Ethan had only just stepped into its beginning. Ethan did not return to the surface immediately after discovering the journals. He remained in the workspace, standing beside the heavy table, letting the weight of the place settle into him. The bunker no longer felt like an abstract structure hidden beneath his house. It felt inhabited by intent, by a mind that had once moved through these rooms with purpose and urgency. The silence around him was not empty. It was saturated with a residue of thought. He set the flashlight down so that its beam washed across the table and reached for the top journal again. The cover was unmarked except for a year written neatly in the corner. When he opened it, the paper resisted slightly, then yielded with a dry whisper. The handwriting inside was precise and disciplined. The lines evenly spaced, the margins respected. This was not the frantic scrawl of a man in panic. It was the work of someone who believed deeply in order. The early entries were methodical and restrained. They referenced international tensions, political events, and technological developments that Ethan recognized only vaguely from history books and documentaries. Dates were noted carefully. Observations were framed in rational language, as though the writer were building a case, assembling evidence that the world was approaching a breaking point. There was no hysteria in these pages, only a steady accumulation of concern. As Ethan turned the pages, he noticed how the focus shifted gradually. Global events gave way to local considerations. Discussions of treaties and weapon systems transitioned into calculations of materials, measurements of land, and notes on excavation techniques. The bunker began to take shape not only as a physical structure, but as a concept born first in the mind before it ever touched the earth. The entries became more detailed, more personal, without ever losing their clarity. The writer described the process of sourcing concrete, steel, and filtration components. He documented setbacks and adjustments, noting where plans had to be revised due to cost, availability, or structural constraints. Each problem was addressed with patience and persistence. Reading it, Ethan felt a strange sense of recognition. This was a man who solved problems the same way he did, by breaking them down, by refusing to panic, by trusting process over impulse. But beneath the technical precision, another current began to emerge. The tone shifted subtly at first. References to other people appeared, not as collaborators, but as obstacles. Family members were mentioned obliquely, their names omitted or reduced to roles. The language hardened when they appeared on the page. There were hints of disagreements, of attempts to dissuade the writer from his plans. He wrote of being misunderstood, of having his concerns dismissed as excessive or irrational. He did not describe shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Instead, he recorded the quiet erosion of trust. As the years progressed in the journals, the world outside the bunker seemed to recede further and further. The entries became increasingly inward-looking. The writer documented legal disputes, strained relationships, and a growing sense of isolation. He wrote about meetings that ended without resolution, about relatives who spoke of money and inheritance more readily than safety or preparedness. He described a moment when he realized that the people bound to him by blood did not share his values or his fears. That realization appeared to be a turning point. From that point onward, the bunker was no longer framed as a contingency. It became a necessity. The writer's language shifted from hypothetical to declarative. He wrote about the bunker as a place where he could be secure not only from external catastrophe, but from the failures of human connection. He began to describe it as his refuge, his safeguard against a world he no longer trusted. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest as he read. The man who had built this place was not simply afraid of war or disaster. He was afraid of abandonment, of being left unprotected by those who should have stood beside him. The bunker was not just a shelter, it was a boundary, a line drawn between himself and everyone else. Ethan moved deeper into the room, scanning the shelves more carefully now. He noticed how the organization reflected the progression in the journals. Early binders contained blueprints and permits. Later, ones held inventories, lists of supplies, and contingency plans. Near the back of the room, behind a row of neatly arranged folders, he spotted something he had missed before. The concrete there looked thicker, reinforced beyond what structural necessity would require. He stepped closer, examining the surface. The texture was subtly different, smoother, more uniform. Years of working with infrastructure had trained his eye to notice such details. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling for seams, for any irregularity that might betray a concealed feature. When he tapped it gently with his knuckles, the sound confirmed his suspicion. There was space beyond. The discovery sent a quiet surge of adrenaline through him. This was not an accident. Someone had gone to considerable effort to conceal whatever lay behind that wall. Ethan retrieved a pry bar from the storage area and returned to the spot, working carefully to avoid damaging the surrounding concrete. It took time and patience, but eventually a faint seam became visible, a narrow outline that traced the shape of a hidden panel. When he managed to ease it open, he found a small compartment just deep enough to hold a sturdy metal box. The box itself was unremarkable at first glance, dull gray and heavy, sealed with a simple latch. But when Ethan opened it, the significance of its contents was immediately clear. Inside were items of unmistakable value. Coins sealed in protective sleeves, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the flashlight's beam. Small bars of precious metal wrapped carefully in cloth. These were not stored casually. They had been placed here deliberately, separated from the general supplies, hidden behind an extra layer of protection. This was not about survival. This was about preservation. Ethan closed the box slowly, his mind racing. The existence of this cache suggested foresight beyond immediate need. The builder had anticipated not just enduring a catastrophe, but emerging from it into a world where resources would matter. Or perhaps he had anticipated something else entirely, a future where he would need to protect these assets from those who might claim them. That possibility became clearer when Ethan returned to the journals. He found entries that spoke openly of legal disputes, of relatives who had attempted to assert control over family property and finances. The writer described a lawsuit that had ended poorly, deepening the rift between him and those who shared his name. He wrote of that day as a final severance, a moment when he resolved to trust no one but himself. It was in a later journal that Ethan found the letter. It was sealed inside a thick envelope, its edges slightly yellowed but intact. On the front, written in the same careful hand as the journals, were words that made Ethan's breath catch. The message was brief, direct, and unambiguous. It was addressed not to a name, but to a condition. To the one who finds this. Ethan stood for a long moment before opening it. He felt as though he were standing at the threshold of something deeply personal, something that had been written with intention and finality. When he finally unfolded the paper, the weight of the words settled over him immediately. The letter was long, but its purpose was clear from the beginning. The writer spoke of his life, of his fears, of the choices that had driven him underground. He acknowledged that he had built the bunker to survive a world he believed was on the brink of collapse, but he also admitted that he had built it to escape the disappointments of his own relationships. He wrote of his family not with rage, but with weary resignation. He stated plainly that they had shown interest in his assets only when it suited them, and that he did not wish them to benefit from his preparations. Instead, he declared his intent to leave everything hidden within the bunker to whoever discovered it, not as a reward for chance, but as a deliberate act of judgment. He wrote that the person who found this place would likely be someone in need, someone who had invested effort and care into the property above, someone who understood the value of endurance. He expressed hope that this person would use what he left behind wisely, not as a symbol of greed, but as a means of survival and stability. Ethan felt a strange mixture of emotions as he finished reading. There was disbelief, of course, and apprehension at the implications of what he now knew. But beneath that was something quieter and more unsettling. Recognition. The man who had written this letter had built his life around fear and preparation. Ethan had built his around endurance and restraint. Their paths had never crossed in life, yet here they were, connected across decades by circumstance and necessity. The realization altered Ethan's perception of the bunker entirely. It was no longer just a hidden structure or a technical marvel. It was a testament to a man's final decision, a declaration made in solitude and sealed against time. The supplies, the hidden cache, the reinforced doors, all of it formed a system designed not only to protect, but to choose. Ethan closed the letter carefully and returned it to its place. He stood in the center of the workspace, surrounded by the artifacts of another man's fear and foresight, and felt the boundaries of his own life begin to shift. This discovery could not be undone. It carried legal, moral, and personal consequences he could not yet fully grasp. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the quiet life he had worked so hard to maintain was about to be tested. The bunker had revealed not only its existence, but its purpose, and, in doing so, it had placed Ethan at the center of a story that was far larger than his careful plans. When he finally turned towards a ladder, preparing to return to the surface, Ethan carried more than knowledge with him. He carried the weight of a legacy that had been waiting, patiently, for someone willing to step into the darkness and listen. Ethan emerged from the bunker late that evening, his body heavy with exhaustion and his mind burdened by knowledge he could not yet organize into anything resembling certainty. The sky above the yard had darkened to a deep, uneven blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear, indifferent to the upheaval unfolding beneath them. The open hatch yawned behind him like a wound in the earth, no longer a hidden secret but an exposed truth that refused to be ignored. The workers had secured the opening as best they could for the night, reinforcing the edges and covering the hatch with heavy material to keep it hidden from casual view. They spoke quietly among themselves, their earlier curiosity tempered now by the seriousness of what had been uncovered. Ethan thanked them and watched their trucks disappear down the street, the sound of engines fading into the ordinary hum of the neighborhood. When the last trace of their presence was gone, the silence felt different than before, heavier, charged with expectation. Inside the house, Ethan moved through his familiar rooms with a strange sense of displacement. Everything looked the same: the worn couch, the carefully repaired fixtures, the modest order he had imposed over the years, and yet none of it felt untouched. The knowledge of what lay beneath his feet had altered his perception of the space. The house was no longer just a shelter he maintained through discipline and restraint. It was a threshold. Sleep came poorly that night. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts cycling relentlessly through what he had discovered. The journals, the hidden cache, the letter, the deliberate intent of the man who had built the bunker. He understood instinctively that this was not a discovery that could remain private for long. Too many people had seen the excavation. Too many questions had been raised. The world above ground had a way of asserting itself, especially when secrets and value were involved. His intuition proved correct sooner than he expected. The following morning, a sharp knock at the front door jolted him awake. When he opened it, he found himself facing two officials from the local fire department, accompanied by a county safety inspector. Their expressions were polite but firm, their presence formal in a way that left no room for dismissal. A report had been filed, they explained, regarding an unpermitted excavation and a potentially hazardous underground structure. They needed to inspect the site. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he kept his composure. He led them through the house and into the backyard, where the partially concealed hatch lay waiting beneath its temporary cover. The officials examined the area carefully, exchanging glances and murmured observations. The inspector asked direct questions about what had been found. Ethan chose his words with care, describing the discovery as an abandoned underground structure built by a previous owner. He did not mention the valuables, the journals, or the letter. Not yet. The inspector warned him that further evaluation might be required. Underground structures posed risks, he said, both structural and legal. There could be issues of code compliance, historical significance, or public safety. Ethan listened, nodding, feeling the walls of his carefully controlled life begin to close in. When the officials finally left, he stood alone in the yard, the open space suddenly feeling exposed rather than private. It did not take long for the story to spread. By midday, his phone began buzzing with notifications. At first, he ignored them, assuming they were routine messages or automated alerts. When he finally looked, his stomach dropped. A local news outlet had published a short article about the discovery of a large underground structure beneath a private residence. The accompanying photo, taken from an angle over a fence, showed his backyard unmistakably. Within hours, the street filled with unfamiliar vehicles. Reporters appeared at the edge of his property, cameras in hand, calling out questions as they approached. Ethan retreated inside, locking the door, his heart pounding. He had lived his life deliberately out of the spotlight, blending into the background through quiet reliability. Now, his home had become a spectacle, his privacy stripped away by curiosity and speculation. He avoided the windows, silenced his phone, and tried to steady his breathing as voices carried through the walls. The attention was relentless. Questions flew freely, unconcerned with his discomfort. How big was the structure? How old was it? Were there valuables inside? Did he plan to open it to the public? Each question felt like a violation, an intrusion into a space that had never belonged to anyone else. As the day wore on, the situation escalated further. In the afternoon, two strangers approached his door. They were middle-aged, a man and a woman, dressed neatly and carrying themselves with an air of entitlement that set Ethan on edge immediately. They introduced themselves as distant relatives of the previous homeowner. They had seen the news, they said, and believed they had a rightful claim to whatever had been found beneath the house. Their tone shifted quickly from polite inquiry to accusation. They spoke of family inheritance, of property wrongfully claimed, of legal rights that superseded Ethan's ownership of the land. They demanded access to the bunker and its contents, their words sharp with suspicion. Ethan listened, his jaw tight, and refused calmly but firmly. He explained that the property was his and that any further discussion would need to go through legal channels. The encounter left him shaken. When they finally left, it was with a promise that their attorney would be in contact. True to their word, a formal letter arrived the next day, delivered by a courier. It claimed that all valuables discovered in the bunker belonged to the estate of the deceased builder and must be relinquished immediately. The letter cited obscure statutes, threatened legal action, and demanded access for inventory and removal. The pressure mounted rapidly. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged Ethan before now found reasons to linger near his property, their curiosity thinly veiled. Some approached him with awkward smiles, asking questions that strayed uncomfortably close to prying. Others whispered among themselves, speculating openly about what he might have found. A few hinted that the bunker might extend beneath adjacent properties, suggesting that they too might have a claim. Ethan felt besieged. The house that had once been his refuge now felt like a stage under constant observation. He struggled to focus at work, his thoughts drifting repeatedly to the letter, the reporters, the hostile relatives. Sleep became elusive. His hands shook more often than he liked to admit. In moments of quiet, his mind returned to the letter he had found in the bunker. The words of the man who had built it echoed with increasing clarity. The deliberate rejection of his family, the explicit intent to leave everything to the one who found the place. Ethan understood now why the builder had gone to such lengths to hide his legacy. He had anticipated this exact scenario, the sudden reappearance of people motivated not by connection or concern, but by opportunity. The realization hardened something inside Ethan. He could not face this alone. With reluctance and a sense of vulnerability he despised, Ethan reached out to a lawyer recommended by a colleague. The woman he spoke to listened carefully, asking precise questions, her tone calm and measured. She agreed to meet with him in person to review the documents he had found. When she arrived at his home, the presence of someone who understood the language of conflict brought a small measure of relief. She examined the journals and the letter closely, her expression growing more focused with each page. She explained that while handwritten documents were not traditional wills, they could carry significant legal weight, particularly when they demonstrated clear intent and were supported by consistent records. The legal battle that followed was exhausting. Relatives of the deceased builder multiplied, their claims growing louder and more aggressive. Motions were filed, counter-arguments were prepared. The media continued to circle, eager for updates and controversy. Ethan found himself scrutinized in ways he had never experienced, his character questioned, his motives doubted. Yet, through it all, the evidence held. The journals documented years of rational planning and clear-minded decision-making. The letter articulated an unambiguous rejection of familial inheritance and a deliberate choice to leave the bunker's contents to the finder. The bunker itself, sealed and forgotten, was undeniably part of the land Ethan had purchased legally. The court proceedings were tense and emotionally draining. Ethan sat silently as arguments were made about bloodlines, entitlement, and ownership. He listened as lawyers debated the meaning of legacy and the limits of property law. When the judge finally ruled, acknowledging the builder's intent and affirming Ethan's right to what lay beneath his home, the weight that lifted from his chest nearly overwhelmed him. The decision did not feel like victory. It felt like survival. The relatives left the courtroom furious and defeated, their threats of appeal ringing hollow against the finality of the ruling. Reporters rushed forward, but Ethan declined to speak, shielding himself behind his attorney. He returned home that evening with trembling legs, his mind numb, his body drained. Slowly, the storm began to subside. The reporters moved on. The neighbors retreated into their routines. The letters stopped coming. Silence returned, tentative and fragile but real. Standing once more in his backyard, looking at the sealed hatch beneath the quiet sky, Ethan understood that the battle had not just been about wealth or property. It had been about whether he would be allowed to honor the intent of a man who had chosen him, unknowingly, as the steward of his final legacy. The world had tested Ethan's endurance in ways he had never anticipated, and he had held. In the weeks that followed the court's decision, life did not immediately return to normal. Normality, Ethan came to understand, was not something that snapped back into place once a verdict was read aloud. It reassembled slowly, unevenly, like a structure repaired after hidden damage had finally been exposed. The street grew quieter first. News vans disappeared one by one until only faint tire marks remained as proof that they had ever been there. Curious neighbors resumed their routines, no longer lingering by their windows or pausing mid-walk to glance toward his yard. The house exhaled as if relieved to no longer serve as a spectacle. Ethan felt the change most clearly in the mornings. For the first time since the discovery, he woke without a sharp knot of anxiety in his chest. The ceiling above him was still the same, the faint cracks and old paint unchanged, but his thoughts no longer raced the moment his eyes opened. He moved through his kitchen with the same careful habits he had always practiced, yet something fundamental had shifted. The discipline that once came solely from fear now carried an undercurrent of choice. The bunker, now secured and legally protected, became a presence he acknowledged rather than avoided. After consulting engineers and specialists, Ethan invested time and money into reinforcing its safety, installing proper ventilation, modern lighting, and secure access. He did not rush the process. Each decision was measured, deliberate, honoring both the complexity of the structure and the gravity of what it represented. This was not a project driven by excitement or greed. It was stewardship. When he descended into the bunker now, it felt different from that first breathless discovery. The space no longer pressed in on him with uncertainty. The corridors were illuminated softly, the concrete walls clean and solid, the silence no longer oppressive but contemplative. He moved through the room slowly, often pausing without a clear reason, simply allowing the atmosphere to settle around him. He spent hours reading the journals in full, not skimming, not rushing. He learned the builder's rhythms, his cycles of confidence and doubt, his meticulous planning interrupted occasionally by passages of quiet despair. He read about the moment construction was finished, about the strange emptiness that followed, when preparation could no longer distract from loneliness. He read about days spent underground, testing systems, rehearsing survival, and nights spent listening to the world above, waiting for a catastrophe that never arrived. What struck Ethan most was not the fear that had driven the man to build the bunker, but the hope buried beneath it. The builder had believed that preparation mattered, that discipline could preserve dignity even in isolation. And when he realized that his own future would end without witnesses or heirs he trusted, he had chosen not to let his life's work dissolve into resentment. He had chosen to pass it forward. Ethan understood that choice more deeply than he was comfortable admitting. With the guidance of financial professionals, he liquidated only a small portion of what had been hidden beneath his home. The money was handled carefully, quietly, through legitimate channels. He paid off his mortgage in full, not with fanfare, but with a steady sense of closure. The monthly calculations that had once defined his life loosened their grip. He addressed long-delayed repairs, updating the wiring, reinforcing the foundation, replacing windows that had never sealed properly. Each improvement felt less like an indulgence and more like restoring balance. He did not leave his job. The thought crossed his mind briefly, but he dismissed it. His work still mattered to him. It grounded him, reminded him of who he was before the bunker, before the cameras and courtrooms. But he allowed himself changes he had once deemed impossible. He reduced his hours slightly. He took time off without guilt. He stopped measuring his worth by how much strain he could endure. In the bunker's study, Ethan created something new. He cleaned the table where the builder had once written, preserving its surface rather than replacing it. On the shelves, he arranged the journals and personal artifacts with care, not as a display for others, but as a private acknowledgement. He kept the letter in a protective case, its words now etched into his memory as much as the page. One evening, months after the storm had finally passed, Ethan descended alone into the bunker as autumn light faded above ground. The house was quiet. The neighborhood settled into its familiar hush. He walked the corridor slowly and entered the study, where the soft hum of ventilation replaced the silence that had once dominated the space. He sat in the chair the builder had likely used, feeling the solid weight of it beneath him. For the first time, he brought a notebook of his own. The pages were blank, their emptiness intimidating in a way he had not expected. He rested his hands on the table and remained still for a long moment, listening to his breath, feeling the presence of the place. Then he began to write. He wrote about the discovery, about the shock of the hatch opening and the world beneath revealing itself piece by piece. He wrote about the fear that followed, the legal battles, the invasion of privacy, the temptation to retreat and hide. He wrote about endurance, not as a burden, but as a practice that had shaped his entire life. He wrote about the man who had built the bunker, about how fear had driven him underground, but hope had guided his final decision. Ethan wrote not to preserve instructions or contingency plans, but to bear witness. He wrote because he understood now that survival without meaning was only half a life. The bunker had been born from fear of the future, but it had endured long enough to become something else entirely. A bridge between two lives that would never meet, yet understood each other completely. When he closed the notebook, he felt a sense of peace settle over him that he had never known before. The bunker no longer felt like a hidden scar beneath his home. It felt integrated, reconciled. The man who had built it was no longer just a name in journals or a presence in concrete and steel. He was a voice that had reached forward through time and been answered. As Ethan climbed the ladder back into the night air, the stars above felt closer, sharper, more real. The yard was quiet, level now, the hazards removed, the ground finally at rest. He stood for a moment, looking at his house, no longer seeing it as a fragile structure he had to defend against collapse, but as a place that had absorbed history and still stood. His life would never be simple again, but it no longer needed to be. Stability had taken on a new meaning, one not rooted solely in caution, but in trust. Trust that endurance could lead to something more than survival. Trust that fear did not have to be the final architect of a life. Beneath his feet, the bunker remained, sealed and secure, not as a refuge from the world, but as a reminder of what could endure when one person chose to leave something meaningful behind. And above it, in the quiet of an ordinary neighborhood, Ethan Walker lived on, carrying that legacy forward, not in fear, but in purpose. If this story held you until the very end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. New stories are already on the way, and the next one may be even more unexpected. Share this video with someone who loves powerful discoveries and hidden truths. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?